Welcome to the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. I am your host, Alex Green, and I'm on a mission to bring the power of embodiment to people all around the world. In this podcast, we explore how embodiment practices, trauma healing, and knowledge about the human nervous system can help us find our ground, discover new sources of meaning, and create connection in an ever-changing world. The deepest change is embodied change.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am so excited to be sitting down for a conversation with Simona Irwin and Layah Jane Singer Wilson. And Simona is someone who I've known for a couple of years now, and Layah is someone who I'm just getting to know through the context of the conversation we're going to have here today. But I'm excited to have it. It's about a topic that I've been wanting to bring into the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast, but haven't found the right opportunity. So this opportunity came forward, and it's about to explore dance as embodiment and somatic practice, in particular, a style of a somatic modality that I've had a lot of resonance with over the years, 5RHYTHMS dance, a framework developed by Gabrielle Roth. And so we will hear that is going to be one of the main focuses of today's conversation. But let me share just a little bit about my guests, Simona and Layah, and then we will dive into what we're going to cover today. Simona is the creator of the Befriending Fear series, which is an active program that she runs, and she's a mindfulness teacher, neuroplasticity coach, and a mother of two. And I got to know Simona originally through one of her previous roles as a mentor in the Primal Trust chronic pain and nervous system regulation program, and where Simona has deep experience working with nervous system regulation principles to support chronic illness and chronic nervous system dysregulation in general. And she has been deeply informed by her own journey, both with complex trauma as well as chronic illness, and as well as certifications in things like somatic parts work, somatic plant medicine integration, and exposure and response prevention certification. So we'll hear more a little bit about some of Simona's background, blending some of these areas of expertise. And then also with us today is Layah Jane Singer Wilson, who is a 5RHYTHMS teacher, dancer, movement facilitator, and a mother and a musician. And if I understand it correctly, Layah, you've been a practitioner for over 20 years of 5RHYTHMS. I think you joined back in the era when Gabrielle Roth was still around. Hopefully we can hear a little bit about that. And as well as a rich movement background with contemporary dance, ballet, eurythmy, and continuum movement. I might remind me. I want to hear a little bit about continuum before we sign off. And she sort of specializes in offering a trauma-sensitive, expressive space for dancers of all abilities, infusing movement rituals with movement and improvisation. Now, why we're all here together for one conversation is that Simona and Layah are just about to launch. They have collaborated on a very cool online course offering a self-paced study called Befriending Embodied Movement: An Introduction to 5RHYTHMS. And I got a preview version of the course. It's not quite launched yet. And what I was so impressed by is that this, on the one hand, this is a introductory self-paced course to understanding the principles of 5RHYTHMS, how to approach it and get the most out of it, but with a particularly nuanced approach to getting started at all ability levels, accessibility. Both Layah and Simona very sensitive to the kinds of concerns that might arise if we are in autonomic dysregulation of some sort, or chronic pain or illness, or other reasons that we may need to modify a practice a little bit. And that was very much sort of attended to in this course format. So what I hope we talk today about is 5RHYTHMS in general, because it's been something impressive, It's been an important part of my own journey, and I want to hear about for each of you, and then how 5RHYTHMS plus um, uh, sort of in some ways much more contemporary principles of trauma informed movement, nervous system principles, how they have shown up in the course that you guys are delivering. So, with all of that, Layah and Simona, welcome. Glad to sit down with both of you.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Yes.
And I should mention, both of you are in Toronto, Canada. So that's which I like to just geographically locate ourselves a little bit. All right, wonderful. Well, I think a great starting point is, I do want to hear about each of your own personal backgrounds a little bit more, but first to start with, like, just how you know one another and how you came together around this course itself, and whoever of you wants to chime in first.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So like you mentioned, I had my own health journey. So a lot of different symptoms, trauma, a lot of challenges, and kind of at the um, back half of that journey, Kat from Primal Trust actually was like, I really think you should find a 5RHYTHMS class. And I think, you probably have something in person in Toronto. So I looked and went online, and it was also the end of COVID or kind of that time. And I found something online. And so I signed up, and that was the first time that I moved with Layah. It was also the first time I had ever been to a dance class. I had no dance background, but of course loved music and loved movement, but just had never formally been to anything. So I went to that class, and it just like really moved me. I was very surprised. And I had this like cathartic release, this moment of like anger and these tears that came. And I really hadn't cried for like really almost like 2 years through this like health journey. It was like blocked. And the tears came. And so it was like the practice. And then there was a beautiful song that came on as the tears came. And it was like that perfect somatic moment of being well met in this incredible way. And, it just like had my heart from that moment on. And then eventually I started to come to more of Layah's classes in person and in the park. And that was kind of the beginning of how we met.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then at some point, I mean, so obviously you were moved by your newer exploration of 5RHYTHMS, because compared to Layah, I've been doing it a long time. But then at some point you decided there might be a collaboration possible. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think, I'll tell you a little bit about the first in-person class that I went to too, because for me, that was kind of another anchor for me. So I remember it was in a local park that we have. It was outside, which was like really special. And at the beginning, Layah demonstrated the 5RHYTHMS practice. And so it was the first time off of the little screen that I had kind of seen this practice, in her body and, the way that she was moving. And I remember just having this felt sense of like, I had never seen someone inhabit their body in that way. And it was so impactful for me. Like I felt it both as permission in my own system, but also this like real interest of like, wait, like what's going on here? And how can I like get some of that in this body? Because this body was really in my head a lot. And so, yeah, so that was kind of this, movement forward. And then, I've been dancing with her for 3 years. So last year at some point, she knew a little bit about my work, and, I'm in all of her work all the time. And I just was like, I think we could do this, and we could offer this to the people I work with who are often homebound or bedbound or chairbound. And I want this healing that I've had through this practice. How can we bring it to more people and make it accessible and make it trauma sensitive? And she instantly was like a big yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
Layah, we've been talking about 5 rhythms without sort of like introducing it too much. I wonder if you could, if we were beginners in your class, or potential people coming to 5 rhythms, yeah, give us a little primer in what 5 rhythms is.
Yeah, happily. So, 5 rhythms is an improvisational movement meditation practice. And so, we're not following steps, we're listening in to what our body's own inclination for movement is. And the 5 rhythms themselves are qualities of energy, qualities of movement. So, again, we're not aiming to mimic how somebody moves, but we're practicing calling on these ways of moving and ways of being to kind of inhabit more of our expressive capacity. And so each of the rhythms, I can name them for us.
Yeah, name it. Yeah.
With my hands, I can show.
Yes, show.
So flowing is just like this fluid, circular, softening, spiraling movement that's continuous. And from flowing, we begin to move into staccato, which has punctuation and starts and stops, and where we can feel our form and our bones and our edges, where I begin and where I end, and the world begins and ends. And as we kind of build some heat maybe and some energy in staccato, we begin to move into chaos, which is, as it sounds, spontaneous, and there's a loosening and a freeing that can happen, where our intention is really to let go in whatever ways are available to us. And out of that spontaneous movement and letting go, we come into lyrical. And lyrical has this quality of, after the crashing of a wave, there's this effervescence of bubbles that comes. And lyrical is like that, where we're bringing in this possibility of moving with ease and effortlessness. So there's maybe a lightening that happens. And lyrical brings us back down the sort of backside of the wave into stillness, which is the last of the rhythms. And in stillness, we're cultivating this sort of settling and spaciousness in our movement and tuning into our breath and letting that whole wave begin to land. So the rhythms take us on this journey. We call it a wave. And when we practice them in order, it takes us on this this exploration of like all of these ways of being that most of us received the message at some point along the way that we were not supposed to move aggressive or with lots of energy or in a chaotic way. And so the process of trying on these different ways of moving is like a vocabulary expander.
Super cool. Going back to when you got pulled into this, maybe you already had a dance background, but what drew you into this world? And yeah, tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, for sure. So as a child and as a teen, I just loved dance right from the beginning. And so I was taking modern dance lessons and ballet. And my favorite part of every class was always the end, where our teachers would invite us to come up with our own choreography, where there was this like creative element of letting my body speak. And so many years of practicing, forms of movement with just a small bit on the side of letting my body move freely. That was always my favorite part, though. And when I was 18, my stepmom took me to my first 5 rhythms class, and she had a feeling that I would love it. And when I walked in the room, it's like 2 hours of getting to move freely. And that sort of listening in and allowing what's inside to inform my movement. It was just love at first sight. So I was a young adult at that time, and eventually abandoned all my other movement classes because 5 rhythms was so much better. And I connected with this whole community of people who were interested in what happens when we allow our body to move from the inside out. And in my early 20s, I think many of us, go through this time in our individuation from our families, from our parents, where we're starting to investigate where do I come from, and what are the wounds that I carry, and how can I free myself to be more of who I am. And that for me happened through 5RHYTHMS and on the dance floor. And I immersed myself in practice for a good decade before I ever considered offering it back or pursuing teacher training. And it was through my own health crisis, actually, that let's say sort of cleared the slate in a way and opened me up to questions like, what is where can I be of best service in my lifetime? You know, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and it was my first real reckoning with my mortality in a way. I was in my late 20s, and I was a singer-songwriter at the time, and, engaged in the performing arts, and really missing the sense of community connection that's possible when we engage together in art making and in beauty making and in meaning making. And so I let my music career dissolve into this space of questioning, where am I needed next? And it was on the dance floor that I heard this like super loud call in one workshop, like, this is it. This is it. It's already here. And the next step is to deepen practice and to study with some of my mentors more committedly, and to enter training. So yeah, that's some of the story.
Yeah, very cool. I'll just reflect for a moment, sort of taking myself back to my first exposure to 5RHYTHMS. A little similar later in my life, but it was when I don't know who suggested it, but it was after I had kind of gotten into somatic work, and was doing a lot of body work and receiving a lot of body work, which I sort of credit as, a little bit like you, as sort of a phase in my life when I was very much trying, sort of in the meaning making part of my individuation process, and what had life meant, what had predated things, and where was I headed, and my gateway drug to 5RHYTHMS was through ecstatic dance, and which I see as having some relationship or pretty clear connection. So I was living in Madison, Wisconsin at the time, and there was a very lovely ecstatic dance community with regular practice, and that was where I first sort of fell in love with this idea that I could move with music and dance, but having nothing to do with. It's not about. It wasn't. Some ecstatic dance, you're interacting with people, but in this place, not very much. It was like not about interaction. It was not about looking cool or performance by any means. It was sort of dance for the sake of dance and for expression and for embodiment. And so I had a taste of that, and I was like, wow, what a beautiful container for just seeing what arises. And we were lucky that pretty regularly we didn't have a local 5RHYTHMS teacher, but we were able to invite people. So people would come up from Chicago or sometimes from New York or somewhere else, traveling 5RHYTHMS people. So I've maybe only done a 5RHYTHMS proper work, sort of long series, maybe only like 5 or 6 times, but like they just completely stand out to me as just these completely rich experiences, both of movement and of connection to self, emotional sort of expression, and the you talked about the wave, and to me there's such a intrinsic logic to that wave that I want to talk a little bit more about. But anyway, you're sort of hearing from both of you. I'm just sort of remembering when it was a new practice for me, and how cool it can be. So super cool. For you regular listeners to the podcast, you know that about half of these episodes focus on TRE, tension and trauma releasing exercises. And I wanted to make sure that you know about the Red Beard TRE certification program, our educational platform to certify others. And we have both an online version of that I teach, as well as an in-person version of the training that my colleague Ellen McKenzie teaches in Madison, Wisconsin. My next online certification training is beginning August 3rd and 4th, 2024. That's the first of 3 modules. And the way the certification program works is it's about a 10 to 12 month program divided into 3 phases of learning, each with a weekend connected to it, and then some one-on-one work with me and people on my team to support your learning journey. TRE has been a life-changing modality for myself. It's open to people with any background. I wanted to make sure you know about the program. You can find more information at redbeardtre.com. What do you know, Layah, about the sort of the origins, like with Gabrielle Roth, like what do you know about sort of how she initially sort of framed things? And I'll tell you where I'm going with this question, is a curiosity I have for both of you is what's different with 5 Rhythms today, or the way that you two are bringing it to the world, as opposed to 1970 or whenever sort of Gabrielle Roth. I think in some ways a lot has changed in terms of the somatic field, nervous system work, the trauma-informed movement. So I'd love to sort of hear, what's maybe different. But maybe Layah, you could take us back to what you understand as sort of the birth of this method.
Yeah, happily. I love both of those questions. Gabrielle also had a background in movement. She was teaching children dance from the time she was a young adult, and she found herself at the Esalen Institute in the early 70s, which was really, sort of the forefront of the human.
That's where everybody was meeting each other. Yeah, everything was happening there. Yeah.
Yeah, so like Fritz Perls was there, Gestalt therapy, and Ida Rolf.
Yeah, Ida Rolf. Yeah, exactly.
So they were all together, as the legend goes, in the baths and hanging out in the hot springs and wrestling with like, how do humans become, transform their relationship to themselves and each other, and all of these really important questions. She was, witnessing these therapy groups that Fritz Perls was running, and noticing that, boy, do humans ever have the tendency to get stuck in story, stuck in our heads. And he at some point, invited her to come into one of his groups, as the story goes, and lead a movement piece, because she was teaching sort of recreational movement at Esalen at that time. And there were drumming circles on the back deck, and people were moving, but it wasn't sort of integrated with the therapeutic space. And apparently, as the story goes, he invited her to come into one of his groups, and they were both like gobsmacked at what they witnessed, how quick and powerful a root in movement can be. And that was the beginning of it all. And, her process of leading movement, the rhythms themselves didn't sort of crystallize as these points on a map until later. My understanding is some point in the 80s, but she was working with groups in a therapeutic setting, and with the kind of curiosity about what happens and what unfolds in our process when we let our bodies be as they are. And when we let our emotions move through our bodies, and give the parts of us expression that have not been invited to be expressed physically. Yeah. And so at some point in the 80s, she started to sort of notice these patterns. When we let bodies move, there tends to be a wave of expression. And that's how emotions work too, right? We feel this wave rising in us. We see it all over and through nature, right? Childbirth and the metaphor is endless. And so she started to...
Or the construction of a good, symphony or...
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so she started to find some language that could act like a map. So we could do this again and again. She could help guide people through this process, especially those of us who really need a lot of encouragement to let that natural uprising have its full expression. So that's when she started to find the words for the rhythms and started to articulate more of the kind of philosophy that comes with 5 Rhythms as well. And, maybe I'll just touch on what I'm so interested to hear what, you would say also, Simona, about this. Your question about what has changed and how...
Yeah, what's changed and
how does 5 Rhythms meet us now compared to how it did when it arose in culture? And one of the things that I notice I noticed, through my time studying with Gabrielle and also the teachers that she taught, is that 5RHYTHMS arose at a time when it seems to me culture was like doing this pendulum swing. So much repression in, my parents, when they were growing up, their parents, like no talking about feelings. Certain parts of humanity were just like blocked off. So in the 60s and 70s, there was this like swing back, right? Yeah. Like all these kind of therapies that from this perspective seem really extreme.
Primal scream and these big cathartic modalities.
Yeah. And in a way, 5RHYTHMS also arose in that sort of time of we need to free our expression in order to heal. And that is true. And from my perspective, what's also true is that we need to practice settling ourselves. And that if we just are always aiming for this like peak cathartic release, we're missing a whole lot of important process too. And that's what I see growing in the last, 10 to 15 years, maybe, is this awareness that certainly, it's in the cultural, it's in the collective. It's not just 5RHYTHMS, this awareness of trauma sensitivity, awareness of what it means to activate and like re-traumatize, what it means to have resources to stay on our windows of tolerance. Like all of these concepts are just growing in. And so I'm seeing them grow in 5RHYTHMS too. And each teacher has their own flavor and, unique way of offering the work. And I will say that, the ones I'm drawn to and what I am cultivating with care in my own practice is really creating a cushion so that we can have these experiences of release that are well held and integrated, not just these peak experiences that can kind of be addictive sometimes, right? So expanding the practice to include the process of warming ourselves up really thoroughly. And, it was all there. Gabrielle named all the places in the wave, but it seems to me that the places that were really needed in culture at that time were more the letting off steam.
Or chaos.
Yeah. That's my perspective.
That's so cool. Well, so Simona, because I'm very curious on your own perspective, because my understanding, you can share a little bit, as much of this that you may want to, but, I understand that, you come out of a pretty significant, developmental, complex trauma, pattern yourself with a high ACE score and then, a very significant healing journey, both at the complex trauma level, as well as dysautonomia, POTS, some of the kind of chronic illness kinds of things. And so, and certainly through your work with Primal Trust, and then what you're doing now with the befriending fear, I think of you as somebody who's both from an inside out perspective and then also working with others, become just an expert at the delicacy needed with sensitive nervous systems and things like that. So I'm very curious to hear your own perspective on how that sort of high level of trauma informedness or sensitivity can be presented within a dance modality like 5RHYTHMS.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what you said is the heart of why we created this. And I think, for me, by the time I made my way to the practice, I had a lot of good tools. So I had this ability to, understand my mind and, what it may be telling me as a limitation, and that it might not actually be true. And it would be safe for me to stay with the surge of energy or the music or, the trigger of someone stomping in the room or whatever that looked like. Right. So there was this, there was a lot of learning as I did the practice myself of like, oh, here's an edge. And then using, these tools of like exposure and staying with, and, the beauty of this, being in this class that's about a wave. And then for me, having these mini waves of like, am I okay? Is this okay? What if what if I have this vertigo that comes back, or what if like the POTS kicks up and I faint in the middle of class? And,
Right.
all of those things were part of my recovery process. And, the fear piece that I work with a lot is this, edge of both holding like, this is true, these conditions are true and they're real and they're expressing in the body, and there's a huge fear and mind element that is always showing, this terrible thing that's going to happen. And then people make their life really, really, really small in this
Okay.
protection.
Yeah.
And so as part of this kind of process, it was like, okay, well, how can I use what I have to start to expand this? And, so when I was talking to Layah about creating this, it was, what are the baby steps that we can bring people into this practice with, knowing a lot of people are not going to come onto a dance floor. It's going to be too loud, and, they might be in pain, or some people might be bedbound, but it doesn't mean that they can't learn this map, internal, external map, and begin to follow it, even if it's just with a hand, even if it's with breath, even if it's through imagination.
Right.
And so that was this idea of like, can we hold people's hands? Can we walk them into this and help them learn this pathway of, moving this wave through the body, and get them to practice it, and through that maybe grow that capacity to step into it in a bigger way. Yeah.
Super cool. Well, so maybe can we talk a little bit about sort of how you implemented that? So maybe kind of like a little bit like the structure of the course, like kind of the flow, sort of how it works. I mean, my understanding is it's it's self-paced, and with the accessibility that comes from that intrinsically, I think maybe part of your vision is that, I mean, of course, some people are finding their way to 5RHYTHMS by joining a live class and being together, but it sounds like part of your vision is that people can approach this from home, and that there might be benefits from that. So yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about like, how did you put these elements together in the course? We'd love to hear that.
Yeah. So, I think the first thing I want to say is the course is both for anyone who's like curious about the practice, whether or not they have certain conditions, or, whether or not they feel stuck at home. Sometimes people are just curious and they like want to check it out first. And before they walk in online or in person, they're just like, what is this about? And I want to like have a bit of information before I try the thing. So for them, it's really set out in the same way that it is for someone who has really specific limitations. And, we start with just an introduction to us and to why we created it, what it's about, where it came from. And then we introduce people to the rhythms, and we do it both in like a seated way, in a full-bodied movement way, verbally. So they're both hearing it and they're seeing it with various levels of accessibility. And then we break it down into a few different practices that people can use for home practice, including like a Zoom practice that we filmed with other people so they could see what it would look like to join a class that way.
I've got a question for you, Layah, sort of on this theme of kind of the 5RHYTHMS and the wave, and then also what may have what I'm thinking is that, kind of coming back to the question of what language may have changed, or what information may be different, because when Gabrielle Roth first developed this, there probably wasn't a lot of language around the autonomic nervous system, and polyvagal theory hadn't been sort of invented yet. Um, so something I'm a little curious about is, when I think about the cycle itself, the wave of the 5RHYTHMS, I can't help but think a little bit in terms of a progression at the level of the autonomic nervous system. The sort of flow is maybe, kind of one state, but then it's sort of built, into, what is the second one?
Staccato.
Staccato gets a little bit more sympathetic, in terms of activation, as you said, it builds a little heat. Chaos is a bit, maybe even more sympathetic, but also might include more spontaneous movement, or even something like closer towards shaking or tremoring. And so I think of that as being sort of an element of discharge. Thinking from the sort of the Peter Levine model, or the Berselli model of tremoring as biological discharge. And then I sort of think about, well, what happens after that? Like lyrical, maybe there's a little more playful element, coming into our social engagement nervous system from a polyvagal perspective, and then of course, what is the last one? Stillness, or sort of something even more sort of restful and parasympathetic. But so anyway, I'm guessing that language wasn't around in the early days, but what do you think? I mean, do you think do you
Yes.
think about the sort of the nervous system aspect of things?
Yes. And I mean, you just articulated it so beautifully. Yeah. I think that we're finding new language to explain what we've been experiencing and what we've been benefiting from,
Right.
It's like, and I also just want to clock that, the technology of moving freely and coming together around music and movement, this is ancient. So
Right.
Gabrielle didn't invent something. And
Right.
so we're finding language for what it means to like be humans in this way, that like, as you say, that the sort of shaking piece of it, like animals shake, humans need to shake too. This is just part of how we discharge energy, and movement is so fundamental to us. And yet we get popped in these like boxes of what it means to be a human. So I think we're finding language now that we didn't have at the time to articulate the truth that we have
Right.
experienced first for thousands of years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. Simona, we lost you for a second, but well, I think where we left off with you is, I don't remember exactly where, but you were sort of naming how, um, not only the structure of the course, but also kind of some of the teaching things, like sort of, how emotion arises, some guidance around how to hold that. So yeah, maybe just share a little bit more about how you're weaving in these kind of trauma informed principles to the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, as we get into the movement portions, I think we begin with discussion of the different rhythms and how they move in our bodies. And then this idea of this practice is really mindfulness. So it's really about, what is here and how does it move and how do we stay with the energy of what's in motion. And so for me, like it's such a simple thing to say, but actually when you do that practice again and again, week over week, something profound changes in your body and your system. So we kind of come from that framework of like, how can we be here with whatever's present? And so we start with some anchors. So, it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to stay with what's here, how can I resource myself to do that within movement? And movement, of course, is a huge part of that. Just the fact to be able to move as we're
Hmm.
feeling things. And in the course, we kind of go through like, here's how it looks in this body, and here's how it looks in small movement or in big movement or seated. And so we walk people through that so they can see those examples and begin to do it with us kind of through the screen, but be able to engage in that together. And then ultimately through the practices that come later, they get to try it out and they have this full permission of like, okay, that's enough. Like I stayed for one breath with that feeling. And actually, I'm going to just tune into the music now. Or they might stay for the full song with that feeling and ride that full wave out. But we really give that it's an option. They get to choose and to start and stop with what their capacity is.
Yeah, cool.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you have, in the development of this course, if you sort of test run any of these. I like I'm thinking of your audience, Simona. Some of the chronic illness, chronic nervous system dysregulation people. That I'm kind of wondering if you've done any dry runs with people, just as part of your process of coalescing to the contents of the course.
Yeah, so there was a couple people when we first like dreamed up the idea. I talked to them about like what would work for you, and where's your capacity at, and how could a course actually meet you and allow you to feel included. And so often a few of the big things were, they were like, well, people are always, they teach embodied movement and they're like full bodied and they're moving all over the place and they have access to levels of energy that I just don't have.
Right.
So there's those types of pieces, and we really took that into consideration, and also this kind of permission and this slowness. Um, and through my other courses, I don't teach 5 rhythms, but I teach this idea of the wave
Mm.
again and again. Where what is it like to stay with a fear wave? What is it like to stay with anger? And what happens at that peak moment, and how do we decide, what is the mind telling us a scary story and what's actually our capacity to let it move through.
Mm.
And so a lot of that kind of pulled, and as we show and share practices, that's woven in through this material too.
Yeah. I'm thinking too that like I'm thinking about some of the like something that I've had to learn when I started working more with certain kinds of sensitive nervous systems, often in chronic illness contexts, things like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, things, and something that I'm thinking this is true across several of the modalities I do, but I'm thinking about TRE, the tension and trauma releasing exercises, which involves this neurogenic shaping process as kind of a key ingredient to it. And something that I had to sort of learn was that, well, even though sort of Joe Schmo on the street might begin with say 10 or 15 minutes of a tremoring practice. If I'm working with somebody for whom their nervous system is quite a bit more sensitive, as well as they're dealing with symptoms and of different sorts, that they might have to dial things way back as a starting point, and that instead of 10 or 15 minutes of a neurogenic tremoring practice, we might begin with a minute or 30 seconds with lots of titration and integration and things like that. And I'm assuming that idea could be present here as well, and wondering if you sort of speak to that in this course.
Yeah, I think really in all the moments that we made it clear that the invitation is to notice what's happening and stay within our capacity, and that agency, developing in a capacity to choose and be in the driver's seat with your own experience, is like
Mm.
hand in hand with having a movement practice that is improvisational, right? There's like, this is about what works for you, and reminding people of that again and again and again. So, in the context of the practices that we're guiding them through, there is always the possibility to take on an invitation and like let it slide off your back, like, water off your back. And there's also the possibility to try on moving up towards an edge that might grow capacity. And that choice is like completely within the realm of the participant. And I, in my teaching practice in the room with people, that's like again and again and again, we need to hear it. I need to hear it. We need to hear
Yeah.
that it's up to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and something I'll add too, is a big part of my work, and I think it's part of Layah's work, and I think it's a lot of what resonates between us is, this invitation again and again to meet what comes up, right? And so sometimes it is true in the practice, especially when we have a complex trauma background or a chronic illness that's created its own set of traumas. When we start to stir things up in the body, we also get scared, and there's associations with that. And then, all of these things can and do get activated, like you said. And, and there's story that comes with that, and there's sensation. And so, within capacity, there again is this invitation of like, what, tell us more about that. Like, what is the fear, and how does that
Mhm.
fear move, and like what does it make you feel like, and like does that have a shape? And for me on the dance floor, that's been a lot of my work. It's like, oh, here comes that story of in my mind, and it says, this is too much, or you can't do this, or you're gonna faint, or whatever that story of the day is when you have
Mhm.
an anxious mind. And it's like, okay, and how does that make me feel, and how can I be so tender with that and still keep moving, and what does that look like? And what I noticed in my own body is that willingness to connect with it and be with it and ride that little wave through created a huge jump in my capacity. And sometimes I was like not interested, and said no and took a break. And so there's that agency and that knowing that people get to choose.
Yeah, and I'm also sort of hearing within that kind of like this opportunity for inquiry. It's like something's arising, and to take a look at that a little bit. What does that, what are my choices here? That's the agency piece.
Mhm.
What am I curious about? But also, are there other, there's a story presents or a sensation presents. Are there any other channels available for me to express this? Say for example through a shape or through movement, or maybe through imagination or meaning or something like that. So I'm kind of hearing that element, sort of an invitation towards self inquiry as things arise.
Yeah, yeah. And, I'll share a little story. We don't go that deeply in this specific course into this, but it was just actually not that long ago in class with Leah. I had this feeling in one of my legs and in my feet, this real heaviness. And I just moved with it. And it was like, oh, this can be here. And I'm going to dance this heavy leg and I'm going to drag it around the room. And, this is how it is. And then this question came of like, where is this leg? Like, why is it so heavy? And this answer came of this image of my childhood home and this like foot and leg just kind of being in like still stuck in that. And I let that come up and I stayed with it and I moved with it. And there was some story with that. But then ultimately, just through that noticing and that continued movement, something started to change. And by the end of the class, the leg was lighter and there was this like integration and this beautiful, I mean, my favorite thing about this practice is like we still do think things in the mind, but ultimately it's like the body has this intelligence and it's metabolizing the past and it's metabolizing emotion, and we don't have to be the doer of it. It's like a happening. And when I think of complex trauma, I think of a loss of trust with life and
Right.
humans.
Right.
And it's like, what better way to gain trust again than to see my body just meeting me so well and doing this for me without having to do it all myself.
Mm.
I love that. To me, that really speaks to yeah, like a belief of mine that where I really resonate, which is that so much of trauma healing, nervous healing, system healing is physiological in nature. And so, this comes through in TRE or somatic experiencing being a big framework of mine. But the idea that uh, you say there is story, there is implicit memory, body memory, whether the context is clear or not. That so much of the resolution, sort of a trauma resolution model, is the idea that the physiology needs to follow a pathway. And certainly, like I'm used to doing that therapeutically with people, and that's one environment. But the idea that same process can be tapped into and self-facilitated in the creative atmosphere of music and movement, but it's not just movement for dance's sake. That at the same time, this deep physiological pathway that sort of is in tandem to healing, trauma resolution, that can be happening at the same time. To me, is such an inspiring idea.
It's absolutely magical. And I'm just listening to you made me think of this. I think Ida Rolf said the issues are in our tissues. And
Right.
it definitely can happen. Like we've discussed that, story comes or thoughts come and we get pulled up into head. But also what sometimes happens is we're moving and just a wave of emotion comes and there is no story attached. And that is a very fascinating and mysterious and powerful experience. And we don't have to know what it's connected to. We can continue to open ourselves with the question of where does it come from, but we actually don't even have to know. If we let it move through us in a physical way, it's good enough. It's plenty.
Yeah.
And it's I love that aspect. We sort of can sometimes just bypass all of that need to figure something out and just enter the process of experiencing. And there are many roads to roam, somatic experiencing being another really powerful one that I also have benefited from. And it touches the same place for me in this sort of approach with 5RHYTHMS of we meeting what's coming and we don't have to make sense of it. Sometimes it just needs to be felt.
Metabolized, moved, progressed, felt. Yeah, I love that. Well, tell me, so this is going to be available soon, and so we'll make sure we people know how to find it. Listeners, we'll include all of that. But a curiosity for mine is this the beginning of something? Do you already envision any next steps associated with this project? Or is this kind of a standalone? I'm just curious to hear where this may be going.
Yeah. So, I think, we both have a desire to continue to offer something that's accessible online.
Yep.
And so our plan in this moment is to, get this out. And we really want this to be the introduction so people can find that, confidence and that safety and like, okay, I'm ready to do this in an online group. And then through my website, through both of our, Instagram accounts, we'll have more information of how people can join something online. So we'll have that offered. And then, of course, there's always both of us have, individual offerings, and Layah has many offerings in Toronto too for in-person movement.
Very cool. Well, so just share with us, maybe by way of closing, the name of the course, and then where the website to find it. And of course, we'll put all the links and stuff in the show notes. But yeah, so what is the title, and how are people? When might they be able to see it, and what website do we need to go to?
Yeah, so it's Befriending Embodied Movement, an introduction to 5RHYTHMS. And they can go to turningtowards.me, and it will be there by mid-April. So it'll be there very soon.
Very, very imminent, almost here. Very cool. Oh, well, both of you, thanks so much for taking time to share about your personal experiences and then the vision to develop this course. And it's so interesting for me to hear all the connections within it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks so much for the invitation to share. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Red Beard Embodiment Podcast. To learn more, visit us at redbeardsomatictherapy.com. or send me an email at alex@redbeardsomatictherapy.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, help spread the word by subscribing and sharing with others. Hope to see you next time.